Jesus Christ made the priest pay for humiliating a poor elderly woman, and the altar fell silent. The sanctuary was full that Sunday morning. Every pew occupied the familiar rhythm of hymns and whispered prayers floating beneath the vaulted ceiling. Father Dominic stood at the altar, confident, composed, delivering his homily as he had done hundreds of times before. Nothing suggested that this Mass would be any different until, without warning, his voice stopped. Not paused, not hesitated, stopped. From the front rows, parishioners saw his face drain of color. His hand tightened around the edge of the altar, as if the marble itself were the only thing keeping him upright. Eyes fixed on the far end of the church, he stared past the last pew, past the shadows near the doors, as though someone invisible had stepped into the room. A ripple of confusion moved through the congregation. Some turned to look. Others held their breath. In that suspended moment, memories collided. A few recognized the name that would soon leave his lips, the name of the elderly woman who had been turned away weeks earlier, humiliated for her worn clothes and the scent of poverty she carried with her. Others remembered the way she had lowered her hands, the way she had walked out alone while the church remained silent. And now, standing before the same altar, the priest's certainty was unraveling. His shoulders began to tremble. Tears welled in his eyes. The gospel lay open unread, as if the words themselves refused to continue. Then, in a voice barely strong enough to travel the length of the nave, Father Dominic spoke not to the congregation, but to the unseen presence that held him there. A presence that felt heavy, undeniable, and impossibly close. Those nearest the altar would later say the air itself seemed to change, thick still, almost reverent. No coughs, no shifting feet. Even the children were quiet. It was as if time had been asked to wait. When the priest finally spoke again, it was not with authority, but with fear and awe intertwined. And when he uttered the name Evelyn Carter, the silence deepened because everyone sensed it at once. This was no ordinary reckoning. Something or someone had come to the house of God to demand an answer. The bells of St. Michael Parish had finished ringing, and the congregation settled into a familiar stillness. Coats were folded over knees, children were nudged into silence, and the soft rustle of pages echoed as missals opened in unison. To most eyes, it was an ordinary Sunday Mass, predictable, orderly, safe. Yet beneath the calm surface, a quiet pressure lingered, felt more than understood. Evelyn Carter entered through the side doors and paused just long enough to steady herself. The cold air outside still clung to her coat, thin and frayed at the cuffs. She smoothed the fabric the way she always did, a small, instinctive gesture, as if neatness might shield her from notice. Her shoes whispered against the stone floor as she made her way down the aisle, careful to keep her eyes lowered. She chose the last pew as she had learned to do over the years, close enough to belong, far enough not to disturb. From the front rows, a few parishioners glanced back, then quickly forward again. Some recognized her, many did not. To them, she was simply another elderly woman bent slightly at the shoulders, hands marked by years of work. To others, those who had seen her before dawn at the laundromat or waiting patiently at the discount grocery, she was a reminder of a life lived quietly on the margins. No one spoke to her. No one needed to. Silence had become the language of her presence. At the altar, Father Dominic moved through the opening rites with practiced ease. His vestments were immaculate, his voice steady and assured. He spoke of reverence, of order, of honoring the sacred. Each word landed cleanly, measured, rehearsed. From where Evelyn sat, the altar felt impossibly far away, separated not by distance, but by an invisible line she was never certain she was allowed to cross. As the Mass progressed, the atmosphere tightened in small, almost imperceptible ways. A woman near the aisle dabbed at her perfume, the scent drifting back through the pews. A man adjusted his jacket, glancing toward the sanctuary. Evelyn shifted, slightly aware of her own body, her own breath, the faint smell of soap and cold that followed her everywhere. She clasped her hands together, fingers stiff with age and arthritis, and whispered a prayer she had learned as a child, one not for favors, but for permission. When the time for communion approached, the congregation rose as one. Lines began to form, orderly and patient. From the altar, Father Dominic watched them come, face composed, posture firm. Evelyn stood more slowly than the others, her knees protesting as they always did. She hesitated just for a moment, measuring the space between her pew and the aisle between herself and the altar. All around her, people stepped forward with quiet confidence. She joined the line at the end, heart-pounding eyes fixed on the floor. To anyone watching, it looked like the same ritual repeated week after week. But for Evelyn, each step carried weight. Each step asked a question she was afraid to answer. Did she belong here really? As she moved closer to the altar, the pressure in the room grew heavier, though no one could say why. The mass continued unchanged on the surface. Yet something unseen had begun to shift, setting the stage for a moment that would break the silence in ways no one expected. The line for communion moved with quiet precision, shoes brushing stone hands, folded eyes forward. From the altar, Father Dominic watched each parishioner approach, offering the sacrament with the same measured cadence. To him, the moment was about order, about preserving what he believed the sanctuary demanded. To those waiting, it was a moment of habit, faith, or comfort. To Evelyn Carter, it was something else entirely. She reached the front, slowly, knees aching, breath shallow. When she lifted her hands, they trembled not from fear alone, but from the weight of being seen. For a heartbeat, everything seemed aligned. The chalice gleamed under the lights. The sanctuary was hushed. And then Father Dominic's hand rose. "Ma'am." The word landed sharper than intended, cutting through the reverent stillness. Evelyn froze, palms, still open eyes lifting in confusion. The priest leaned back slightly, his expression tightening, gaze traveling not to her face but to her coat, her shoes the signs of a life worn thin by years of work and want. "You can't receive communion like this," he said. A murmur rippled through the first rows, a sound quickly swallowed by silence. Evelyn's hands remained extended as if she hadn't yet understood what was happening. Father Dominic continued, his voice steady enough to carry. "This is the body of Christ," he said. "It requires dignity." The word echoed heavy in public. He lowered his voice just enough to sound corrective, rather than cruel, yet loud enough for those nearest to hear. He mentioned cleanliness. He mentioned presentation. He mentioned respect without once looking at her eyes. A woman in the third pew shifted uncomfortably. A man behind her cleared his throat and then stopped himself. Somewhere in the back, a child whispered a question and was hushed. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Evelyn felt the heat rise to her face, a familiar burn she had learned to endure. Slowly, too slowly, she lowered her hands. The movement felt enormous, as if each finger weighed a pound. Her shoulders curved inward, protecting something fragile inside her chest. She opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, but no sound came. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, though no one had asked for it. Father Dominic gestured toward the side aisle, not unkindly, not gently, efficiently. "Please come back when you can present yourself appropriately," he said, already turning to the next person in line. Evelyn stepped back, then another step, and another. The altar, once distant, now felt unreachable. As she turned away, she could feel the eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with relief that it was not them standing there exposed. The silence pressed down harder than words ever could. She walked down the aisle alone, each step measured, deliberate, as though breaking the rhythm of the mass would somehow make things worse. When she reached the doors, she paused, hand resting on the cool wood, steadying herself before stepping outside. Inside the church, the line resumed. The prayers continued. The mass moved on. But something had shifted. What had been a sacred ritual moments before now carried the weight of an unanswered question, one that hovered in the air long after Evelyn disappeared into the daylight, and one that would not remain unanswered for long. The doors of St. Michael Parish closed behind Evelyn, with a muted thud sealing in the prayers, the hymns, the orderly continuation of the Mass. Outside, the air felt sharper, colder, as if the world itself had drawn a line she had just been pushed across. She took a few unsteady steps, and then stopped, the strength leaving her all at once. Evelyn lowered herself onto the stone steps beside the church wall. The same wall she had passed thousands of times now, pressed hard against her back, unforgiving and real. Her hands rested in her lap, still curved, as if they were meant to hold something that had never arrived. For a long moment she simply stared at them, confused by how empty they felt. From inside the church, faint music drifted through the walls. Communion hymns, familiar melodies, the sound of belonging. Each note landed like a reminder of what she had just lost. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but with a slow, sinking realization that settled deep in her bones. Across the small courtyard, a few parishioners passed by, avoiding her eyes. One woman hesitated, then turned away. Another offered a quick apologetic smile before hurrying off. No one stopped. No one asked if she was all right. The humiliation had followed her out the door, clinging quietly, refusing to be spoken aloud. Gloria Reyes found her there minutes later, breathless, coat half-buttoned. She knelt beside Evelyn without hesitation, placing a hand over her own. "Don't listen to him," she whispered urgently. "God isn't like that. You know that." Evelyn shook her head slowly. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than air. "Maybe he is," she said. "Maybe I did something wrong." The words surprised even her. They didn't sound like rebellion. They sounded like surrender. She looked down at her coat, at the worn seams she had stitched and restitched. She thought of the cold mornings, the laundromat before dawn, the careful counting of coins at the grocery store. She thought of the way people wrinkled their noses without meaning to, of how often she tried to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. "If God wanted me there," she said, eyes glistening, "he wouldn't have let that happen." The sentence fell between them, heavy and final. Gloria protested softly, but Evelyn no longer seemed to hear her. Something inside had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly, like glass under steady pressure. For decades, her faith had been the one thing that did not depend on money, health, or approval. It had been hers, and now even that felt conditional. When she finally stood, her legs trembled beneath her. She didn't look back at the church. She couldn't. Together, the two women walked down the block, past storefronts and parked cars, until the sound of bells faded completely. In her small apartment later that afternoon, Evelyn sat alone on the edge of her bedcoat, still on hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was quiet except for the hum of traffic outside. She stared at the wall where a faded picture of the Sacred Heart of Jesus hung crooked on a single nail. It had belonged to her mother. She had never taken it down, even when there was nothing else left to keep. "Where were you?" she whispered, not in anger, but in exhaustion. "I tried." No answer came. Only silence. And in that silence, Evelyn did something she had never done before. She doubted not just the church, not just the priest, but the idea that she had ever truly been seen at all. The afternoon light crept through the narrow window of Evelyn's apartment, dull and gray, settling on the cracked linoleum floor. She sat where she had been for hours, coat still on hands, folded, as if the morning had never ended. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, voices rose and faded. But inside the room, time felt suspended, heavy with what could no longer be undone. The knock came softly, almost apologetic. Evelyn startled, heart jumping, and rose with effort. At the door, a folded envelope had been slipped halfway through the mail slot. No return address she recognized. No name written by hand. Just her apartment number printed neatly, officially. She knew what it was before she opened it. Her body knew, tightening in places that had learned to brace for bad news. She sat back down at the small table and unfolded the letter. Final notice. The words stood out in bold, impersonal type. The letter explained everything with cold precision: overdue rent, accumulated fees, a remaining balance that might as well have been a foreign language. 30 days. If payment was not received in full, eviction proceedings would begin immediately. There were no explanations, no room for conversation. Just a deadline and a signature stamped at the bottom. 30 days. Evelyn read the number again, as if it might change. It didn't. She did the math automatically, the way she always did, counting her weekly earnings, subtracting groceries, bus fare, medication. The result was the same one she had reached 100 times before. There was no path from where she stood to what the letter demanded. She folded the paper carefully, hands steady, despite the pounding in her chest. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet, shaped like a daisy, was another notice from the electric company. Power had been cut months ago. The room was quiet now, darker earlier, each evening. Hot water was a memory. The eviction letter didn't just threaten her home. It threatened the last small island of dignity she still occupied. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The church, the altar, the way her hands had been left empty. The images collided with the words on the page until they felt inseparable. Rejection had followed her home and taken a seat at her table. In another apartment down the hall, a television laughed. Somewhere below, a couple argued. Life continued in all its noise and motion, unaware of how close one woman had come to disappearing. She stood and crossed the room to the small dresser by her bed. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out an envelope of her own, old creased soft from being handled too many times. Inside were receipts, medical bills, reminders of a past illness that had taken her husband and left her with debts she never fully understood until it was too late. She counted what little cash remained, lining the bills up with care. It wasn't even close. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, eviction notice resting in her lap. Her shoulders slumped, not with tears this time, but with something heavier. The truth, unadorned and merciless, stood in front of her now. Faith-wounded pride stripped, and a home slipping through her fingers. Outside, a siren wailed briefly and then faded. Inside, Evelyn whispered the only honest prayer she had left, not for miracles, not for answers, but for strength to face what was coming. Because now the danger was no longer theoretical. It had an address and a deadline. The next morning arrived without comfort. Evelyn rose before dawn, the eviction notice still folded on the table like a silent witness. She washed her face in cold water, smoothing her hair with careful fingers, choosing the cleanest dress she owned. It was old, the fabric thinned by years of use, but it had been scrubbed and pressed the night before. Today, appearances mattered again. They always did when hope was involved. Gloria had mentioned a possible job, heavy work, but honest. A woman across town needed her curtains washed before relatives arrived for the holidays. The pay was more than Evelyn earned in a week. Enough to breathe. Enough to imagine for just a moment that the deadline on the letter might loosen its grip. She left early, walking instead of taking the bus to save the fare. The city was quiet, streets washed pale by morning light. With each step, Evelyn rehearsed what she would say if asked about her experience, her reliability, her willingness to do whatever was needed. She had learned long ago that survival required readiness. The house stood on a manicured block, its windows bright, its porch swept clean. Evelyn paused at the gate, steadying herself before knocking. She checked her watch. Exactly on time. She knocked once, then again. No answer. After several minutes, the door opened, not to the woman Gloria had described, but to someone younger. The daughter, perhaps. Athletic clothes, perfect posture, phone already in hand. Her eyes moved quickly, efficiently taking inventory. Yes, she asked. Evelyn explained why she was there, her voice polite, hopeful. The young woman frowned slightly, glancing past Evelyn as if expecting someone else. My mother had to leave town unexpectedly, she said. She won't be back for at least a week. Evelyn's shoulders sank. I was told to come today, she said quietly. If there's anything else you need cleaned, I can... We already have service. The woman interrupted, stepping back. The words were final, rehearsed. She glanced again at Evelyn's shoes at the hem of her dress. I'm sorry, the door began to close. Please, Evelyn said before she could stop herself, one hand lifting instinctively toward the frame. I really need the work. The woman hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then her expression hardened, not with cruelty, but with distance. I can't help you, she said, and the door closed fully, the lock clicking into place. Evelyn stood there longer than she meant to, staring at the wood where her reflection had briefly hovered. The sound of the lock echoed louder than it should have. She turned slowly, the weight of disappointment settling deep in her chest. On the walk home, the city seemed sharper, less forgiving. Store windows displayed things she would never afford. People passed with purpose, unaware of the calculation unfolding in her mind, how many days she could stretch what little she had left. The job had already been spent in her head, allocated carefully to rent food medicine. Now it was gone, taken back before it ever truly existed. At the corner, she stopped, breath catching. The pattern was unmistakable now. Church, home, work. Each door closed in turn. Each rejection quieter than the last, but no less complete. By the time Evelyn reached her apartment building, the hope she had carried that morning was gone. Not shattered, worn down methodically until there was nothing left to hold. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, the silence greeting her like an old companion. Another chance had slipped through her hands. Another lifeline cut short. And for the first time, Evelyn wondered not how she would fix things, but whether there was anything left to fix at all. By late afternoon, Evelyn found herself standing across the street from St. Michael Parish again, unsure how her feet had carried her there. She had not planned to return. In truth, she had sworn she wouldn't. Yet the building rose before her, unchanged, solid, indifferent to everything that had happened within its walls. The doors were open just slightly. Inside, the church was empty. No hymns, no congregation. Only the soft glow of votive candles and the faint echo of her own footsteps as she moved down the aisle she had fled days earlier. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because there was no strength left to pretend. Evelyn slid into the last pew and bowed forward, hands covering her face. The sound that escaped her was not a prayer. It was not even a plea. It was the quiet breaking of someone who had reached the end of her endurance. She cried without restraint, not the careful tears she allowed herself in public, but the deep, shaking sobs she had swallowed for years. She cried for the door that had closed in her face that morning, for the eviction notice waiting at home, for the humiliation she could not forget, for the belief, once steady now fractured, that God had seen her all along. From the sacristy, Father Dominic heard the sound and paused. He stepped into the nave expecting perhaps a penitent or a visitor seeking counsel. What he saw instead unsettled him. The woman in the back pew was folded in on herself, her grief raw and unfiltered, as if the church had become the only place left where she could fall apart. He approached with measured steps, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Carter," he said, voice controlled. "I didn't expect to see you here." Evelyn lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but there was something else in them now, something stripped of fear. "This is my church," she said quietly. "I've been coming here longer than you've been standing at that altar." Father Dominic folded his hands, a familiar posture. "What happened before?" "It was necessary," he replied. "There are standards. Reverence matters." Evelyn rose slowly, steadying herself against the pew. Her knees ached, but she did not sit back down. "Standards," she repeated. "Is that what you call it?" Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You think I choose to live like this," she continued. "You think I choose to smell like cold mornings and cheap soap. I worked my whole life. I cared for my husband when he was dying. I gave when I had nothing left to give." Father Dominic shifted the certainty in his posture, faltering. "Faith requires effort," he said. "And dignity," Evelyn answered, meeting his eyes at last, "is not measured by perfume or clean shoes. God sees the heart, not the clothes." The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. For a moment, Father Dominic said nothing. His jaw tightened, pride stepping in where humility had not yet arrived. "This is not your place to decide," he said at last. Evelyn nodded, a sad, understanding gesture. "You're right," she said. "It isn't." She turned and walked toward the doors, her back straighter than it had been in days. Outside, the late sun caught the stone steps, casting long shadows across the courtyard. She did not leave with answers. She did not leave with help. But she left having spoken the truth she had been swallowing her entire life. And in that truth spoken through tears, not bargaining something inside, Evelyn shifted. It was not hope yet, but it was no longer surrender. The steps near the overlook were nearly empty by the time Evelyn reached them. The city stretched below in muted shades of gray and gold rooftops, catching the last light of the day. She lowered herself onto the cold stone, breath-shallow, heart racing from the long walk and the weight she carried inside. People passed by in fragments, footsteps, voices, laughter, yet none of it touched her. Hunger pressed against her ribs, a dull ache she had learned to ignore. She closed her eyes, letting the noise blur into distance until dizziness forced them open again. That was when someone sat beside her. Not too close. Not too far. Close enough to be present without invading the space she guarded so carefully. The man wore a faded jacket, jeans worn thin at the knees, shoes scuffed from miles of walking. Nothing about him drew attention, and yet his presence settled the air as if the steps themselves had grown quieter. "Those stairs can be tricky," he said gently, nodding toward the steep descent. "I've seen plenty of people lose their footing here." Evelyn managed a small breath of a laugh. "They won today," she replied. He smiled, not wide, not forced, just enough to soften the lines of his face. He didn't ask her what was wrong. He didn't rush to fix anything. He simply stayed. Minutes passed. Then he spoke again. "Have you eaten?" The question caught her off guard. Not "are you okay?" Not "do you need help?" Just that. Practical, exact. She shook her head. "Not today." He reached into his pocket and placed folded bills in her open palm, closing her fingers around them with a care that felt deliberate. "Get something warm," he said. "You'll feel steadier." Evelyn's first instinct was to refuse. Pride rose, automatic and fragile. "I can't." "Yes," he said softly with a firmness that wasn't force. "You can." She looked up, then really looked, and something in his eyes made her stop arguing. They were calm, dark, attentive eyes that did not skim the surface, but rested as if listening to something beneath words. "People don't usually notice," he continued, as if answering a thought she hadn't spoken. "But being hungry makes everything heavier." Evelyn swallowed. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough," he replied. The certainty in his voice unsettled her. He spoke of her husband, of the long nights and the quiet endurance of giving when it cost her something real. Not in detail, not intrusively, just enough to make her breath catch. "How do you know these things?" she asked. He glanced out over the city, then back to her. "Because I see you." The words landed with a strange warmth. Not pity, not judgment, recognition. He stood brushing dust from his jacket. "Take care of yourself tonight," he said. "And remember, kindness isn't rare. It's just quiet." Before she could ask his name, he was already moving down the steps, blending into the rhythm of passers-by. Evelyn watched until he disappeared from sight, the money still warm in her hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough to eat, enough to stand. As she rose carefully, strength returning to her legs, something else returned, with its small, unfamiliar, and undeniable. Not hope yet, but the sense that for the first time in days she had not been invisible. And that feeling stayed with her as she walked away, carrying a kindness she could not explain. Evelyn had taken only a few steps away from the overlook when the man spoke again, his voice calm, certain, as if time itself had slowed to make room for the words. "You don't sleep much anymore," he said. She stopped. The sentence was simple, almost careless, yet it struck her with the force of a confession spoken aloud. She turned back slowly. "How would you know that?" she asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he continued, each word landing with unsettling precision. "The nights are the hardest. That's when the memories come back. The hospital room, the beeping machines, the way you counted every pill because you were afraid to waste a single one." Evelyn's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the bills in her hand. "You sat by your husband's bed even when the doctor said there was nothing more to do," the man went on. "You told him it was okay to rest. You told him you'd be fine even though you didn't believe it." Her eyes filled. She hadn't spoken those moments aloud to anyone. Not to Gloria, not to the priest, not even to herself. They lived only in the quiet corners of her mind. "How do you know my husband?" she whispered. "I know the way you held his hand," he said gently. "I know the prayer you whispered after he passed, the one where you promised you'd keep going no matter how hard it got." Evelyn felt the world tilt. This was no longer kindness. This was knowledge, intimate, exact, impossible. "You're carrying a letter in your apartment," he added, his voice lowering, "folded carefully. You've read it so many times you can see the words without opening it. 30 days. Her knees weakened. She sat back down heavily on the stone step. "No one knows that," she said, shaking her head. "No one." The man knelt slightly so they were eye level. There was no urgency in him, no triumph, only a quiet steadiness that made it impossible to look away. "You've been asking where God was," he said. "You've been wondering if being poor made you unworthy, if being tired meant you failed." Tears slipped freely, now unrestrained. "I just wanted to be seen," Evelyn said. "Just once." His gaze softened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper than comfort, something that felt like truth spoken into a wound. "You have always been seen," he said. "Every step, every sacrifice, every moment you thought no one noticed." She searched his face suddenly, afraid of the answer to the question forming in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked. He smiled, not as a stranger would, but as someone who had known her a long time. "That matters less than what comes next," he replied. He rose to his feet, dusted his hands, and gestured toward the city below. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "go to the small religious shop near the old market. Ask for Arthur Bennett. He has something for you." "What is it?" Evelyn asked, voice trembling. "A reminder," he said, "that help doesn't always come the way you expect, but it always comes on time." She stood as well, her heart pounding. Will I see you again? He met her eyes one last time. You already have, he said. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the thinning crowd as if the city itself had opened to receive him. Evelyn remained on the steps long after he was gone, the evening air cool against her face. Everything around her looked the same, the buildings, the streets, the fading light. But nothing felt the same, because someone had spoken her life out loud, and only one kind of presence could do that. The next morning Evelyn woke before the alarm she no longer needed. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by the echo of words she could not forget. Go to the small religious shop near the old market. Ask for Arthur Bennett. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the city wake up, wondering whether hope had finally crossed into foolishness. The shop was easy to miss. Tucked between a bakery and a closed storefront, its faded sign read, Sacred Corner Gifts. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and candle wax. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with small statues, rosaries, prayer cards, objects of faith worn smooth by countless hands. Behind the counter stood an older man with silver hair and thick glasses. He looked up as the bell above the door rang, and before Evelyn could speak, his face softened with recognition. You must be Evelyn, he said. Her breath caught. I'm sorry. Do I know you? He smiled gently. Not personally, but I was told you'd come. He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a plain manila envelope sealed and unmarked. This is for you. Evelyn hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Who told you? She asked. A man, Arthur replied simply. Didn't give a name. Just said you'd been carrying more than your share for a long time. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be. Slowly she opened it. Inside were neatly stacked bills. Hundreds. 50s. 20s. Evelyn counted once, then, again, her lips moving silently. When she reached the final bill, she stopped breathing altogether. The amount was exact. Not a dollar more. Not a dollar less. The precise number printed on the eviction notice folded on her table at home. The number she had memorized in the dark. The number that had haunted her nights. This can't be right, she whispered. Arthur nodded. He was very clear. Said it had to be exact. Evelyn sank into the chair beside the counter, the room spinning. Where is he? She asked, tears streaming freely now. I need to thank him. I need to tell him. Arthur shook his head. I asked the same thing. He just smiled and said, she'll know who helped her. Then he was gone. Moments later, Evelyn stood at the bank counter, the envelope clutched tightly to her chest. The teller counted the money carefully, eyes widening slightly as the total appeared on the screen. Your balance is now 0, she said, sliding the receipt across the counter. The account is fully settled. Evelyn stared at the paper, reading the words over and over until they finally made sense. Fully settled. Her home was safe. Outside the bank, she leaned against the brick wall and cried, not quietly, not politely, but with the full force of relief. Passers-by glanced at her and moved on, unaware that a life had just been rescued in plain daylight. Later, back in her small apartment, Evelyn placed the receipt beside the faded image of the Sacred Heart. The room was still the same, cracked walls, cold air, borrowed light, but everything felt different. The miracle had not come with thunder or fire. It came in an envelope, with the exact number written on her fear, and a reminder that grace, when it arrives, wastes nothing, not even a single dollar. The following Sunday, St. Michael Parish filled again, as it always did. Families took their places. Choir members adjusted their folders. The altar candles were lit with practiced hands. To anyone arriving late, it looked like another ordinary Mass, untouched by what had happened beyond its walls. Father Dominic stepped to the ambo with the same measured confidence he had worn for years. His vestments were pressed, his posture upright, his voice prepared. He began the homily on judgment, on discipline, on reverence, on the danger of taking sacred things lightly. Heads nodded. Pens moved in margins. Everything followed its familiar script. Then he stopped. Not gradually, not thoughtfully, as if something had cut the sound at its source. From the front pews, people saw his fingers tighten around the edge of the lectern. His breath hitched. His gaze drifted past the congregation, settling on the back of the church, where light pooled near the doors. A few parishioners turned curious. Others sensed the shift and held still. Father Dominic's face lost its color. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again without sound. What he saw no one else could. A man stood where the shadows gathered, plain clothes, unremarkable, utterly calm. Yet the priest felt exposed beneath that gaze, as if every thought, every choice, every quiet act of pride had been brought into the open. The words came to him without warning, not spoken aloud by the man, but unmistakable all the same. With what right do you reject those I love? Father Dominic staggered back a step. The sanctuary seemed to shrink around him. He remembered the woman at the altar, the way her hands had lowered, the way she had apologized for existing. He heard his own voice as it had been that day, firm and certain, and felt the weight of it collapse inward. Tears blurred his vision. His knees gave way. Gasps rippled through the pews as the priest fell to his knees before the altar, hands covering his face. The silence that followed was absolute. No whispers, no shifting, no music. Only the sound of a man breaking under truth. "Forgive me," he said at last, his voice cracking. "Forgive me, God." Then louder, trembling words he had never planned to say. "Forgive me, Evelyn Carter." The name moved through the church like a shockwave. People exchanged glances, memories aligning all at once. The humiliation, the quiet woman, the day no one spoke. Father Dominic lifted his head, tears streaking down his face. "I judged what I had no right to judge," he said. "I guarded the altar with pride instead of love. I rejected someone you never rejected." Those nearest the sanctuary would later say they felt something pass through the room, an intensity, a presence, then lift. When Father Dominic looked back toward the doors, the man was gone. The mass did not continue as planned. There was no music, no prepared prayer, only a humbled priest kneeling before the altar and a congregation confronted with a reckoning they had not expected to witness. Word spread quickly after that Sunday. The priest who had once spoken with certainty now spoke with caution and compassion. The homilies changed. The doors of the church stayed open longer. A small sign appeared near the entrance within the week. "All are welcome, no exceptions." And somewhere beyond the stone walls of St. Michael Parish, a lesson had been delivered, not with anger, not with force, but with a silence so complete it left no room for denial. The altar had not thundered. It had gone quiet. And in that quiet, a debt far greater than money had been paid. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but unmistakable changed at St. Michael Parish. The doors opened earlier and closed later. A folding table appeared near the side entrance with donated coats, canned food, and handwritten notes that read, "Take what you need." Father Dominic no longer watched from a distance. He served, he listened, he learned people's names. And Evelyn Carter came back. She wore the same coat, the same shoes. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Yet when she stepped into the church now, heads turned not with judgment, but with recognition. A few parishioners smiled. Some nodded quietly, as if acknowledging a truth they had once missed. When it came time for communion, Evelyn walked forward without hesitation. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were clear. After the Mass, she stayed. She helped sort donations. She poured coffee for those who lingered because they had nowhere else to go. She listened to stories, stories that sounded uncomfortably familiar. Rent overdue, jobs lost, loneliness that pressed hardest at night. And each time she offered what she had once needed most attention, without conditions. One cold afternoon, a young woman stood near the coat table, a baby balanced on her hip, eyes darting with the same quiet panic Evelyn once carried. She asked, barely above a whisper, if there was any work available. Evelyn didn't ask questions first. She handed her a warm jacket. She wrote down an address. She said, "You're not alone. We'll figure this out." The woman cried. Evelyn didn't. She understood now what those tears meant. Outside the church, life went on in its ordinary rhythm. Buses arrived late, bills came due, hard days still happened, but something had shifted in Evelyn. She no longer moved through the world as if apologizing for her existence. She had been seen fully, unmistakably, and that knowledge had settled deep, unshakable. Sometimes when she walked home in the evening, she felt that familiar calm return. Once or twice she thought she glimpsed a man across the street, plain, close, unhurried step, watching with quiet approval before disappearing into the crowd. She never chased him, She didn't need to, because she knew. Months later, a small plaque was placed near the entrance of St. Michael Parish. It didn't bear her name. It read, "May this always be a place where dignity is not earned, but recognized." Evelyn touched it once gently, then turned to help set up chairs for the next meal. She had learned something no sermon had ever taught her, that faith is not proven by how clean we appear, but by how willing we are to see those the world overlooks. That miracles don't always arrive with light and thunder, but with presence, precision, and perfect timing. And that once someone has truly been seen, they are forever changed. Now she made a point of seeing others. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt invisible, unworthy, or pushed aside, know this: you are seen too. And sometimes the greatest miracle begins when one person chooses to notice another. If you believe that love still moves quietly through the world, doing its work one life at a time, please like this video and subscribe to Stories of Grace. Share it with someone who might need to be reminded that they matter. And if this story touched your heart, leave a comment below, because every act of kindness begins the same way, by seeing.